Good evening, folks. This is Deb Delapiana, and this is your short take. Tonight, we're going to just spend a few minutes talking about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. This is his day today. And I've noticed, just going out there on Twitter, because I refuse to call it X, that all of the right-wing Republican hypocrites are out there showing pictures of Martin Luther King as if they really give a shit about Martin Luther King. These are people who defended the Charlottesville March. These are people who continually denigrate immigrants and people of color. These are people who really, all of everything they do is just for show because they mean none of it. And when they talk about Martin Luther King, they forget that they're talking about a man who made all of his accomplishments without one act of violence, never called for an act of violence, never asked for his people to commit acts of violence to get where they were going, unlike their leader, the great orange jackaloon. So please stop it already, because you know what? Everybody's on to you on this one. So let's talk about Martin Luther King's achievements during his abbreviated time on the planet, okay? Thanks to a racist. Now, everybody knows the story of Rosa Parks about how she refused to accept the rules of segregation on the bus and was arrested. So Martin Luther King organized the Montgomery bus boycotts in response to that. Those boycotts lasted 385 days. That's more than a year, folks. That's what we call peaceful civil disobedience. And it ended the following year in 1956 when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. Let's move on to 1957, where he founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the whole purpose behind the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to amplify the call for racial justice. So basically, all across the South, he combined the efforts of 60 Black ministers along with civil rights leaders to help amplify the call for equality and racial justice. You know, I now look at the South and I look at all of the right-wing Christian entities in the South, and they're not anything like this. In fact, a lot of these right-wing Christian entities are calling for just the exact opposite of this. It kind of makes you wonder, how could we have gone this far afield of everything that we once stood for? 1963, the Birmingham Campaign. The Birmingham Campaign was put in play to call out police brutality and injustice. And it basically proved that there are consequences for those who act unjustly outside the law based on race, and it helped to set parameters for events that might come up in the future. In 1963, the Great March on Washington, not 10,000 crazy zealots trying to reinstall a dictator, but 250,000 people of color and their allies amassing on the Mall in Washington to call for jobs and racial justice. No violence, no storming of the Capitol, no zip ties, no beating of police, just peaceful protest. In 1964, he was no small part of getting the Civil Rights Act to pass. It ended segregation in public places, and it banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was also awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, quote, for his nonviolent struggle for civil rights, end quote. And when he received that award, Martin Luther King Jr. publicly thanked all of the people behind him who helped him to achieve this without violence. People who had courage, people who were determined, and people who persevered without acts of violence. In 1965, under President Lyndon Johnson, the Voting Rights Act was passed. He had led marches in Selma, addressing the voting inequality, and the Johnson administration responded by sending a bill to Congress which would remove race-based restrictions on voting in the South. And that included eliminating literacy tests as a prerequisite for voting. You know, those were Martin Luther King Jr.'s major accomplishments. But he never, ever spent a day on the planet doing anything but advocating for justice and advocating for the rights of his people. And he did it with dignity and without violence. So it really sticks in my craw when I see the GOP out there reposting pleasantries to Martin Luther King. When I remember all of the backlash and the bullshit that went on when we tried to get Martin Luther King Day to be a national holiday. The same bullshit, by the way, as when we came up with Juneteenth, the end of slavery in America. And it's funny that all of the time this whole thing was going on, that all the lily white people were bitching and moaning about it being a holiday. But when the bill was finally passed, but it didn't take effect till the following year, the first people to complain about not getting the day off right away were honkies. So, folks, I just want to say this. This is Martin Luther King Day. It's a day to remember his accomplishments and a day to remember his character. And people out there on the right, they're making a mockery by reposting stuff, but it's even worse out there. People like Charlie Kirk, who runs Turning Point USA, you know, the group that indoctrinates school-age children into racists, bigots, misogynists. He's out there today talking smack about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, like it was the biggest mistake on the planet. Those are the people, folks, we need to disempower. And the way we do that is by getting rid of the GOP. Because every racist in America that's allowed to flourish has enablers, as we have seen. And it's time to put all of that shit to bed. I will talk to you all later. Have a great Martin Luther King Day.